Welcome back to the church. My name is Sherry Pascarella, and I'm the executive director here. And on behalf of everybody joining us tonight who works here, as well as our board and our co-founders, I'm delighted to introduce this evening's program, Donnamarie Barnes. And this is, of course, Knowledge Friday. And this is a very special Knowledge Friday because Donnamarie Barnes was on the original wish list for Knowledge Friday speakers before the church opened. Wow. And when I first started working here and was explained to me what Knowledge Friday was, which is a program conceived by our co-founder, April Gornick, intended to invite wonderful people from our community to come forth and share their stories for the benefit and enrichment of us all. And seemed like a great program to me, and we were trying to map out who the next speakers would be. And April said, gosh, Donnamarie Barnes, if she would only say yes. So I thought, I can do that. And it wasn't up to me, actually. We have a amazingly strong, strident, and intelligent, but reserved individual who finally decided that this was her year to do Knowledge Friday. Wow. And here we are. It's true. So we are going to hear about Donnamarie Barnes was sort of on the list of people to feature in Knowledge Friday. I guess April had her on the list of people who had inspired the whole series, another one of whom was Andrea Scavone, who we had here. And actually everybody we featured this year were people who really represent the core of the concept of Knowledge Friday. And we're delighted to start the year off with them. So that includes Catherine and Marianne from Caneos, who are here tonight, fortunately, and they were here. Our knowledge. Yes, you can applaud for them. They are also fabulous and hardworking and contribute so much to the life of our community. And after that was Andrea Scavone, of whom the same may also be said. And of course, Donnamarie, who, like Catherine and Marianne and Andrea, has cultivated their own life in this community from the inside out and then back again. Somebody who takes their own curiosity and love and passion and all spectrum of human emotion, turns into something that's a tangible, living history of the world in which we live. In the case of Donnamarie, it's her own works of art, as well as her work with Sylvester Manor, and as well as the project that is currently on view at the Sag Harbor Cinema. And all of these external manifestations go to the core of a person whom I guess we all look forward to learning more about tonight. So that's my introduction. Welcome, welcome, wow. Donnamarie Barnes.
Thank you. Wow. Can everybody hear me? The mic's okay. Way to raise the bar there, Sherry. Thank you so much for coming. I've been very excited about this and been thinking about it a long time. I was scheduled to do this talk in October, but was unable to because we lost a very great friend of mine and of our community, Glenn Sujet. Don't cry, May. And so it just wasn't the right time because I wanted this talk to be about joy. And when you're freshly in grief, you can't really talk about joy. And so some time has gone by, and I'm very, very happy to be here at the end of a very long February in Black History Month. And for those of you who were with us on Saturday night, thank you again so much for your support for the Sag Harbor Cinema and the Plainside Project. But tonight's a different kind of night. And maybe that's why I'm a little nervous, because I'm not going to tell stories from Sylvester Manor or the Plainside Project. I'm going to tell my own story. So bear with me. I am Donnamarie Barnes, and I live in Sag Harbor, and I'm a photographer. And those two things are very much intertwined. I live in the historic community of Nineveh Beach, in the sands communities of Sag Harbor, which, if you don't know, and I think everybody does know, are the historic African-American communities of Sag Harbor established in the late 1940s. I have spent my whole life here as a summer resident, every year of my life summer resident, until now when I am a full-time resident. And I love being here in the wintertime because it's the first week of March, and look how many people come out to events here at the church, so it's wonderful. My life here in Sag Harbor now involves history and telling stories. And in thinking about what to say and talk about tonight, I realized that that is very much the theme of everything that I've ever done, and the connection between my photography and the work that I do as they call it, making a living. My life here in Sag Harbor is anchored by our beachfront, a very special place to those of us who grew up here in Sag Harbor, and especially in the communities. My story begins with my parents, Arthur and Gladys Barnes, who came to Sag Harbor in the early 50s. My mother worked for a doctor named Dr. Binga Disman, who was one of the original property owners of Azurest. He had a beach house. That's my dad standing on his deck. Usually, gentlemen these days don't wear their sports coats and their pipes standing at the beach, but that's my dad. And they started bringing me here when I was 6 months old. And it became, as my brother and I grew up and my extended family, the real center of our lives. The other 10 months of the year were just the time we spent waiting to come back to Sag Harbor. When I was a teenager, my father gave me a camera. He was an amateur photographer himself, which is why I have all these wonderful childhood photos. And he bought me a camera, and being on the beach and having my camera in my hand as a young girl really did feel like I'd found my path. My circle was complete. And since then, I have worked always primarily in Sag Harbor, and that has always been my anchor. I studied photography in college, first at Emerson College and the Boston Museum School, and then at the Cooper Union School of Art, where I aspired to be a working photographer. Now, going to an art school, as many of you know, teaches you a great deal about art, but not so much about making money. And so when I graduated, I had a grand plan that I was camera in hand going to Europe to shoot for an extended period of time, of which my parents said, "That's lovely, dear. How are you going to pay for that?" And so that became sort of the bottom line, as with every artist. How do you pay for your passion? How do you pay for the way forward so that your soul is fulfilled, but you are a functioning human being, not on allowance? And so a series of things, jobs, whatever, but photography and Sag Harbor has always remained my base. Now, those of you who are chuckling will remember what this is. On 114, there was painted on the railroad tracks this sign, "Virgil is still the frog boy." It was sort of a favorite saying, God knows what it means, or who actually wrote it. These are from probably the 1980s. One of the things that happened along the way in having a camera in my hand is my dad, once again, gave me his old Leica camera, 35 millimeter rangefinder camera, which is small, sleek, and very sexy to have in your hand. And I wore it on a wrist strap, and so it was always just in my hand. And it really did change my life, because up until today, I still have a Leica in my hand. I debated bringing it with me, but I didn't want to be one of those photographers who go to talks or galleries with their Leica slung over their shoulder as their fashion accessory. We all know the type. I began a series of beach portraits of my friends on the beach in Sag Harbor. As I was finding my way, one with the Leica, and two as I was a young mother, single mother at the time. I was doing some odd jobs, but just trying to find my way. And photography was really the method that I chose to help me find myself. You might recognize her. This is Nanette Carter, whose work is hanging upstairs in this show. We were friends together in Sag Harbor. And so these are all beach portraits, which are how I characterize most of the work that I do in Sag Harbor, although now they don't necessarily involve taking portraits of people. But this is a slice of life in Sag Harbor that I remember. Now, it's interesting that this is actually the first time that I have ever shown these images in public. So I hope they're okay. This is the beloved Bill Pickens in a Boys Harbor shirt that he was always in. It's kind of quintessentially Bill. And these two youngins are now grown-up people who still live here full-time. Reynolds Ruffin and his wife Joan, two artists who lived in Nineveh. At the same time, when I was in the city, I was starting to work on the street, take photographs as a street photographer. And so I tried using the techniques that I was using on the street in some of the portraits that I was doing here in Sag Harbor, and just having the work really overlap. This is Richard Clark, who was a resident of Nineveh, who was a great patron of the arts, and hosted one of the first East End artist exhibitions at his home. He was a great supporter and inspiration. And again, I've never shown this portrait. And my forever inspiration, this is my son, Alex. Yes, give a boy a cowboy hat and a scarf for a cape, and they'll be happy forever. So because I was a young mother, because I was a photographer, every photographer's child will tell you stories that their parents constantly would say to them, ooh, ooh, the light, the light. You must stand in the light. And that was a constant refrain said to Alex, who was always a perfect subject. Again, older. Only a mother could get a child to lay in the water. I was working primarily, and, well, I still love mostly working in black and white. And again, having that Leica in my hand just made me feel not invincible, but powerful, and it was almost like magic. So this is an example of the street work that I was doing. At the time, I was hanging out with a lot of black photographers in New York City. I was teaching at Hunter College and being mentored by Roy DeCarava, who was a great photographer and wonderful mentor. Tough. You could never satisfy Roy. And again, it was a period where I was working every day, I was printing at night. My son tells stories about, being a very little boy, thinking it was normal to be put to bed by your mother and then have her go in the basement and work in her darkroom. And the next morning, there would be photographs laid out of what you did the day before. It's always very interesting to have these remembrances from his perspective, because he was with me so much of the time. So this body of work was primarily done in Harlem. He and I were spending a lot of time in playgrounds, as you do with little kids. And I was finding my way of being a street photographer. As I said, I was I was working and sort of hanging out with a group of Black photographers who were very influential and trying to find my vision, which for me, in looking back at them, was full of a slight sense of whimsy, rhythm, and mostly light. Again, I have not really shown these images very much publicly. As time went on and things changed for me, and I moved on to different kinds of jobs and still doing photography on the side, and more time went by, the negatives and the prints of this work got put in the closet for a long time, until the last few years when I was able to bring them out and re-look at them and rediscover what I had done. The basketball boys. Working on the street takes a sense of humor, or when you look at the images later, you realize that there is a sense of humor. You may not notice it in the moment. A lot of the work that I was doing was happening very fast because you're walking around and you see things, or I would walk down the street and someone would say, "Hey, baby, take my picture." And I would say, "Fine. How do you want me to take your picture? How do you want to look in my pictures?" Probably 83, 84. Also around this time, so I was teaching at Harvard. No, I was teaching at Hunter. Slight difference. Still not, making enough money to make a living, and still trying to figure it out, and still working with several photographers. And I got a job as a photo editor at Essence magazine. Growing up, I think many of you will remember, if you had a subscription to Life magazine, you often got the Time Life books, which were a great resource. I had a whole series about photography and art masters, and there was one Time Life book that was called How Life Gets the Pictures. And it was about photojournalists being given assignments, going out and working a story, and then working with an editor who then went through the work, chose images that became the stories in Life magazine. It fascinated me. And so that was what I decided that I wanted to do, become a photo editor. So first I was working at Essence magazine, and then for an international news agency called Gamma Liaison. And that meant that I took steps back from my own photography, which is why the negatives started to migrate into the closet. I was working with international photographers, and my beat, as I say, was hard news, international news, war, and disasters. It was very heavy, a little traumatizing, but it was in the days of before digital, so photographers were going out into the field shooting film, shipping that film raw back to either New York or the office in Paris, and then the editors were responsible for editing the takes to create stories. So I call myself a storyteller now, and I realize that I've been a storyteller for a very long time, first with images and now with words. And in those years of working at Gamma, I worked with some amazing photographers on some incredible stories, but it takes a toll. You can only see disaster and war victims so much. And I went from Gamma Liaison to being a photo editor at People magazine, which is a whole different kind of news. Working there for over 14 years. This period of time that we're in now. So I've been very busy, as you know, with Black History Month. In my old life, which is how I refer to it, February through early March was award season. Starting with the Golden Globes, the Screen Actors Guild, the Independent Spirit, and the Academy Awards, which meant heavy volume of photo editing, negotiating, setting up photographers, and I was really good at it. Getting to work at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning and editing 100,000 photographs in a day is what it kind of took. To this day, photographers on the red carpet at the Academy Awards will all try to get the photograph that will make me happy. That was the big competition. What's the photograph that Donnamarie is going to say yes, that will turn into the double spread in People magazine that week? But after a while, that gets old too. And in addition to just editing events, I was the paparazzi negotiator. So what that means is, during the days of Brad and Angelina and Ben and Jennifer the first time, when you would hear on the news, and People magazine spent $2 million on a photograph of blah, 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 that was what I did. That was me. I spent a lot of money in bidding wars, but the lesson of that, as I make jokes about it, but I was really good at learning how to take care of my photographers, how to protect their rights, how to negotiate, how to do the business of photography. And that trickled down to the photographers that I am still friends with who were doing commercial photography. My being in that end of the photo business benefited them because I knew how to do it. I knew how to set up a shoot, and I knew how to negotiate with the client. And so I was serving two different parts of myself. And after 14 years, the magazine business, the photo business changed once again. It was no longer photographers using film. It was now all digital. I myself had switched from film. Again, my very wise dad called me one day and he said, "Sweetheart, you're never going back into the darkroom again. Let's face it, you need a digital camera." So we went and we bought a digital Leica, which fits just in my hand the way the old one did. And when I decided to leave People magazine, the natural thing to do was to come home to Sag Harbor, to figure it out. And little did I know in figuring it out what that would be until I took a visit to Sylvester Manor and was drawn in not just by its story and its history, but by the beauty of the place. And started working there and telling the stories and digging into the history and becoming a historian. I was not always comfortable saying that, but I'm better at it now. I am a historical storyteller. The best part about it is that I get to interpret those stories with my own photography. So finally, I have a job where I can do both. I can be the editor, I can be the curator, I can be the storyteller, and I can be the photographer who finds those stories in the landscape and who can continue to have that kind of growing passion for what I do. So these are all images that I've taken at the Manor. It's a body of work that I actually entitled Manor Suite. And again, like in everything that I have done, it's about passion, it's about rhythm, and it's about the light. As well as photographing at the Manor to illustrate and to interpret the work that I do there. Living here in Sag Harbor full time now, I can spend as much time as I want to on the beach, as I do. And I find that the off-season is actually one of my favorite times to photograph here, because it's empty, because it's dark, and because the light here is so extraordinary. And I think if you really think about it, that's what really attracts us, so many of us, to this area, is the extraordinary light. When I go to the city, and especially in these last years when, you know, things have been very dismal and going into Manhattan is very different, there's something about the light there sometimes when you're really in the city that I'm like, I just have to go. And as soon as I cross that canal and get back on the East End, I feel better. Because it is the light, because it is the golden salt light that we have here, that I find always at the beach. And so these series of photographs that I call beach portraits, once again, that are devoid of people, that are primarily of the same space, but it's never the same, because being at the beach, the light is different, the sky is different, the color is different, the water is different. I can walk out on my deck every morning and it's the same view that I can photograph, sometimes with my iPhone now. That's always, always different and always says something else to me, but always stirs me. This is Frank Wimberly, whose work is also upstairs, who has always been a great friend, a great supporter, and an immense inspiration. Growing up, Frank was a friend of my parents, and we would go to visit him, and going to Frank's house was always an experience. It was down a cul-de-sac road that before Sag Harbor Hills was paved was this incredibly dense sand road that you could never drive to Frank's house because you would never get your car out. But going to his house, as I said, was always an experience. It was always open. He and his wife, Juanita, we were always welcoming, no matter whether you'd been invited or not, and most of the times we weren't. I was friends with his son, who was in my age group, Nanette and I, and we would go and sit, and primarily we would go to talk to visit Frank's son, Walden. But we would always, she and I, end up talking to Frank about his work, about our work. He was always interested in what we did. He was always open to having me bring my portfolio, my photographs to show him. And he was always, always encouraging and supportive. And for that, I will adore him forever. And more, as I was putting this together and trying to figure out what to show, I saw just how influential he really was, that in some of the beach portraits that I do now, they are somewhat abstract. I have been involved with the SANS Steering Committee, the organization of the developments of Sag Harbor Hills, Azure Rest, and Nineveh, that has been working for historic recognition. And sometimes we needed photographs of the beach area for either publications or informational, and they would say, Donnamarie, can you give us a beach picture? It's harder than you would think for me to find one that's straight sort of editorial and not like artsy, which when I realized that was actually made me very happy, because it made me feel like I'm not just taking photographs of the beach, of the sunset. I am actually seeing something else in it, something that Frank taught me how to see. It's the same view, but it's totally different. And as time has gone on, my inspiration has grown up. This is Alex and his son Ellis, who is my brand new subject, that I get to say, ooh, ooh, the light. And when Alex became a father, the first present that I bought him was a Leica to hold in his hand. so he could photograph his son as he grew up. Sag Harbor is my home. It is my inspiration. It is my passion. It is the place that I am a photographer and that I am a storyteller, where I study the history of this place and I photograph my memories. I often say, when I'm giving a tour or a talk of the Sylvester Manor or with the Plainside Project, that I feel that the landscape here holds the memory of the history. And the photographs that I take here for me, they hold the memory that I feel here and my being here, and my life, that I've spent all of it here, that I hope to spend the rest of it here. And the photographs that I make here, they are my memories. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donnamarie. That was amazing. We are going to open it up for questions. First of all, I think I can safely speak on behalf of everybody, which is always a dangerous thing to do, but your photographs are amazing, and thank you for sharing them with us. I can't believe they have never been seen. They deserve to be seen, and this is just a small number of the people who should see them. They really are wonderful and masterful, actually. I think as somebody with a background in art history, it's also the tributes to the history of street photography and specific photographers are really strong and really solid, and very clear that you align yourself with the history. Before getting into that subject, I want to ask something much more personal, which is that you had mentioned that your first Leica was your father's camera, and later he had made the observation of your the impending importance of digital photography, and that begs the question to who was your father, and was he an artist? Was he a photographer? What was his background?
So my father is Arthur Barnes, and he was a photographer as a hobby growing up, and it's something that he's always done, and so that's something that we've always shared.
But he wasn't a professional artist?
No, he was not.
Amazing.
He is not.
He certainly has a flair for aesthetics, that's for sure.
Yes, he does.
Let me say, before I ask any of my other own questions, because if there's so many different angles, there's a richness of all people's lives, really, that we don't often get a chance to see and explore, and that is a privilege, so thank you for that as well. And there's so much here with regards to the history, your life and the history of Sag Harbor and the history of photography in the 20th century, and we can delve into any of those. Does anybody have a question? Oh, we have a few. Mary Ann first, and then I'll cover Lee. Uh-oh.
Okay.
Okay, well,
maybe I can hear you.
Can we try hearing? Mary Ann, do you want my mic, or do we think we might be able to hear you? I can repeat it. Why don't you say it, and I'll repeat the question.
So thank you for showing us your photographs. We're honored to see them. Would you mind, I'm just so curious about the editorial process a little bit. So would you mind talking to us a little bit about some of the decisions that go into your editing photographs at the two primary places that you told about? I'm just really curious what makes it get in and what makes it on the floor, and like what makes it spread.
The question, for the sake of archival purposes at the camera, is can Donnamarie describe her editorial process, what makes it in, what's left on the floor, and why do you make these choices? And I would add to that, for your own work as well as for other photographers. Is that the same also?
No, I don't think it's the same, but the first part of your question about how do you make the story, what gets in and what doesn't get in, it becomes very intuitive, and it also becomes very personal in the editor's relationship to the photographer. It always worked best when I had a closeness to the photographer. So when you are a photographer's photo editor, you are the person who sees what they do. And in those days of photojournalists shooting film before digital and shipping it raw, meaning shipping it unprocessed, the photo editor was really the first person after the photographer took the photograph to see the work. And so having a personal relationship, friendship, understanding of what they were shooting, not just what the subject matter was, but how they were approaching it, was almost key and became very instinctual, so that I knew what frame was the one that they thought was going to be it. Then, in addition to that, understanding who your clients are. So I worked for a news agency that sold photographs to the news magazines, when we had news magazines who bought photography. Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, of course, had their own staff, but the New York Times Sunday Magazine bought photographs from agencies. And so knowing the editors on that end, what they were looking for. So it became a series of close relationships to the client, relationship primarily to the photographer. What got left on the floor oftentimes were the images that were too much. Not that they were bad photographs, but that especially if it was traumatic subjects such as coverage of war. For a long time I covered conflicts in Africa, Somalia, Mogadishu, Rwanda, which was bad, earthquake in Haiti, flood in Bangladesh. So what you leave out is what is too much for general publication to be seen. But that doesn't mean that you don't see it and you don't live it. And I always felt like even the things that were hard to look at, I have an obligation to my photographer because he or she shot it. And I have to tell them what it was like. So, for instance, I worked with a photographer named Scott Peterson, who is still working. He writes and photographs primarily for the Christian Science Monitor. And he was working in Africa. And again, shipping the film raw. Those were the days where you would tell a photographer to go to the airport, wrap your film up in an envelope with duct tape, and hand it to a passenger flying either to New York or to Paris at the gate. Of course, if you tried that now, we'd never see you again. But that's how we got film from conflict zones. And so Scott was working in Africa, in Somalia, in Ethiopia during the famine, in Rwanda, photographing the genocide, and he wasn't seeing the work. And so it was my responsibility to tell him by facts how the work was, how he was shooting. You're overexposing. He had a terrible habit of exposing for the sky and not for the African's dark skin. So his film was, you change the exposure, change your film speed. That I'd have to write out in faxes that he would get every couple of days whenever he went back to the hotel. And it was actually just last week that he wrote a piece for the Christian Science Monitor because he is back in Somalia, but this time with his 25-year-old son, covering, again, the conditions that are there. So, hope that answers you. Oh, and what about you? How do I edit my own work? That's an interesting question. So, the street photography that I showed you, as I said, those were the negatives that got put in the closet. There were a series of prints that I made at the time that I would show friends and whatnot. But when I went back recently, actually, that was one of my pandemic activities, to take the negatives out of the closet. When I looked at them again, I didn't always pick the same images that I had printed. I found surprises, which was just delightful. So I think for my own editing, it's what I remember, what I was trying to capture in the moment. But what you were trying to capture in the moment isn't always the best shot. And it does take some time and some space to sort of see like, oh God, that was really good. How come I didn't print that the first time? So that series of work really had a lot of surprises that I've just recently discovered.
Thank you. Okay, Lee had a question here.
Thank you. Well, I have two questions, actually, also. One is quite personal. I mean, not like real personal, but and the other is more along the lines of your talk. The personal one is, I went to Cooper Union also in the architecture school, and we were probably there maybe about the same time. But I wondered, was that a good school for photography? Were there mentors? Or
Yes.
was it good as just training in art in general?
Both. So I was there from 75 to 77.
Yes, we were there the same time.
Oh my God. How great. Do you remember the disco parties in the architecture floor?
No,
Oh, okay.
I was in the studio.
Okay, different story. So yes, Cooper Union was a really good school for art. I went there because I knew that I wanted to be a photographer. I wanted to study on a different level, and I understood that to feel artistic about my own photography, I needed to understand more about making art in general and art history. And so Cooper Union for me was a challenge because I didn't paint and I didn't draw. I was really good in art history, but having to take those different disciplines was challenging, but also was great. It helped me sort of, it made my photography better. I did learn to draw. I never really learned how to paint, and that's okay, I can live with that. But it was a really great experience. It was also it wasn't a different experience, but it was a unique experience in that the years that I was there in the art school, I was the only black woman in the school. I kept thinking they had different schedules, that maybe they took more of the classes at night. But as time went on, I realized that I was the only one, which was okay. It was, it was a situation that I had been in once before in private school, so I did know how to deal with it. I just didn't know that I was going to still have to deal with it. When I was admitted to Cooper Union, Jeannie Matusami Ash, who is a black photographer, was graduating, and it was actually being introduced to her, and her saying, you have to apply to Cooper and take my place. I didn't think she meant it literally. That was really the impetus for me going there.
Oh, she's wonderful. Well, my other question is about the work. And, sitting here with this enormous screen and seeing the images at tremendous scale, I just wonder, is it the object or is it the image, or how do they relate? Because obviously you make all sorts of choices about creating an image at a certain size to have a certain impact on interpretation, and then it gets blown up like this, which is really marvelous.
Yeah.
But
yes, it's actually that's a great question. I think of photography as being tactile. Part of the difficulty for me in switching from film to digital was the loss of that tactility, of not making a print. Even looking through the viewfinder on a digital camera, it's not ground glass, so it actually looks different. And it takes a little getting used to, and it threw me off for a very long time. Seeing my images this size is a little daunting. I still like making prints, even from digital files. It's still important to me to print my work. I remember someone saying to me once, "Oh, but you can show it on your TV screen." That's not why I make photographs, to show on my TV screen. I make photographs to make prints out of, to hold in my hand, to feel the texture of the paper. That's what's important to me. So even when I make prints now of digital files, I'll do it sometimes on different kind of paper. I've printed images on newsprint, which is kind of a nice, different kind of texture, and just, you can do different things using different kinds of papers. So thank you for that. That's a really great question.
Thank you, Lee. I actually had a question. I'm going to go back to the audience in a second, but you touched on it when you were talking about being at Cooper Union and literally being the only woman of color. I guess to paraphrase, and when I was looking at your work, I was thinking about some of the other artists who were mentored by Roy DeCarava. Some of whom were included in the Kamoinge show at the Whitney Museum of Art, which included one black female photographer, Ming Smith. And one of the things that I had read about in an article with her was not only about the experience of being a female photographer, a female artist, at a time where that was challenging for all artists of color, but particularly female artists, also from anywhere. And part of that was about the process of photography, being out in the streets, and what it means to be a street photographer. Did you ever feel, how did you feel being in the streets as a woman? And I guess an inherent part of that for you as being a woman of color was, how did that play into the work?
Right. That's another great question. Ming Smith is a black female photographer who is part of a collective called Kamoinge, which is made up of black photographers that was started in the 60s. And I was friends with a lot of them. I still am friends with a lot of them. And so coming up in that same time period, I was a little bit younger. So, even in, my Sag Harbor group, I was a little bit in the younger group. That's never stopped me. And so when I started working as a street photographer, I was, as I mentioned, hanging out with some photographers, and sometimes I would tag along with them on the street. So I would have them with me. I never felt unsafe. I would either be with other photographers or I would be with a 2-year-old, which amazingly was a great equalizer, So here I was with a stroller and a camera, and people didn't really know what to make of me. But I never felt uncomfortable. I never felt endangered. You go up in New York City, you have that sense of what street you should and should not walk down, and whose picture you should and should not take. But again, because I was a woman alone on the street with a camera in my hand, not on my shoulder, but in my hand, and shooting primarily in Harlem, people talk to me on the street. A friend of mine says that I have pedestrian beauty, that people talk to me when on the street and want to know what I'm doing, or hey baby. So if a guy says hey baby to you, that can either be offensive or you can use it. And I chose to use it. So hey baby, take my picture. I was not offended. I said yeah, because that's what I was doing. I was taking pictures, photographs of black men on the street. And so having a subject volunteer actually worked really well. Being a photographer of color in this time period, and even till today, has been important to me and my contemporaries. And as I put this together and tried to think of, well, what am I going to talk about and how is this going to really go, I realized how much influence they have had on me and still have on me. Again, I started working in editorial photography because I needed a good job with benefits, and because my street photographer friends were starting to do commercial work and they needed to know how to do it. And so the deal was that I would have the straight job and I would learn the business. And then we would apply what I was learning to what they were doing, and that really worked.
That's such an incredible, generous answer. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. So, two things, really, a comment and a question. In your street photographs or pictures of your friends, I just have been marveling at the way the back of a person can be so expressive. Was that something conscious that you were doing when you were photographing? Because they're almost more expressive than when you see the front of somebody. I just thought it was incredible. And my second question is, do you have a website where some of your photographs are posted?
I'll answer the second part first. No. And that's mostly because I haven't had time to figure that out. I always think that I'll get to that in my next phase. So website TK. Photographing the backs of people. Yes, I have noticed that that's a running sort of visual theme, and I think it has to do with pattern and rhythm. That I see the shapes of the figures and what that conveys. And also, again, because I was doing Black street life, it's a gesture of culture. It's a way to portray the people of how Black people move and how they stand and how they hold their bodies and how that has a generalization and generality and a flow to it. It's a kind of language, as well as the influence of music. I talked about visiting Frank Rimbley and talking about art and listening to great jazz. Well, there's always been music playing when I'm working, either in my head when I'm out shooting. Definitely, I can't edit without music. I could never work in a darkroom without music, and all of that's about all that influences everything. The sounds, again, just the rhythm, the pattern, the musicality, the sensuousness. Photography is very sensuous. And equating it with sound and music and song in movement. I once saw a short film about the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is, of course, everyone's hero and the Grand Master. And it was a film of him. He refused to be interviewed because he didn't do interviews, but he allowed this camera to follow him on the street as he made photographs, and it was like a dance. And being out with photographers out on the street often reminded me of that it's a dance, that you move your body as the world is moving, and what you're looking for is that moment that something in your head clicks. It's the moment when it all comes together. A dear friend of mine calls it the transition from an impulse to a meditation. And it has to do with breath. It has to do with when you see something, when you focus that camera, when in that split second you know that that's the way you want it, and you press the shutter. And, everyone says that, when you take a picture, it goes click. Well, most cameras don't go click. They make all kinds of other sounds, but it's not click. But there is a click. There's a click inside your head that makes it go, that this is yes. It's a moment of yes.
That was so beautifully expressed. Question. I have another question, but please go to our front row here.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Joan Lee Montefusco. I love this work. I truly appreciate you doing this evening. It's a wonderful thing. I'm an artist, and I've always taken photographs from a young age, but my mediums are across the board. My question is a pragmatic question. So I have a cupboard filled with negatives. Negatives, and like a whole thing. And I have my own way of organizing whatever that is. My question is an organizational one. When you decided, lucky you, there was a pandemic and it went on for, it's still going on, but a good solid 3 years. Did it take a lot of courage to open that cupboard? And when you dove back in, was it only a period of time that was in that cupboard? And were there contact sheets? So I know you had the business of it. I'm sure
Yeah.
you were very organized with the business of organizing other people, but were you as organized with
That's
yourself?
Well, that's a great question. And what you said, what you said about courage is really very astute. So the pandemic edit, we'll call it, was my second attempt at taking the negatives out of the closet. A few years before that, I was going through a divorce. It was an emotional time. I was in that transition of having left People magazine, not yet having discovered Sylvester Manor, or not yet being hired by Sylvester Manor, when I didn't know what I was going to do, and I thought, well, this is the time to take the negatives out of the closet. And I couldn't do it. I didn't have the courage. It was too emotionally fraught, because looking at your archive is not just looking at the work, these individual photographs, it's looking at your life. It's looking at your journey. And at that point, I wasn't ready to confront it. And so, however many years later, in those COVID days of what am I going to do now, I can't, make any more bread or cookies or watch another episode of whatever it was. I could do it. And also because I had found another work that made me very happy. And I had come home to Sag Harbor and decided to live here full time. And I was happy is the only word. I was myself, and I was ready to find the surprises that I found and to be able to confront the past and to not regret any of it. Was it organized? Pretty much. I mean, my negatives were all in sleeves. Most of them had contact sheets. They weren't always together. But I had the time, and it worked.
I'm going to ask a question, and Talina can go. My question before, I just want to go one step backwards to a subject that you were touched upon, which was Frank Wimberly, and it does connect a little bit to the show that's on view here, which features 4 artists whose friendships started in the Sands community, and some of them moved on, like Gregory, and others remain deeply rooted in Sands for the rest of their lives, and that's clearly a part of your life as well. And my question is about the continuation of artistic community in Sands. Is there a sense that a new generation of artists is able to thrive and be supported as this generation that you were influenced from is aging and passing?
That's good. I would say yes. For the last, Olivia, is it 2 years or 3 years? For the last 2 years, over the summer, at the end of the summer, we have held a community art show and sale in the Sands community in Sag Harbor Hills, which is, in many ways, the continuation of the exhibitions we held in the 70s and 80s for the group that we called the East End Artist, or the Eastville Artist. And it's a chance for the community to come together, for the artists who live within the community to show and sell their work, for the community to gather, and to continue this tradition of the arts, not just in Sag Harbor, but in the place that we live. And of course, the grand master of all of that is Frank Wimberly, who has continued to show his work. There are some younger artists. I'm very happy that I've been a part of it. Michael Butler is a part of it. And we hope that Olivia White has been the organizer, and we hope to have it again this summer.
August 25th.
There you go, August 25th. I'll get right on that.
We hope to make some, to share the information on that. Actually, at the opening of this, Paula and Errol, I don't know their last names.
Taylor.
Thank you, Paula and Errol Taylor had said, how come you didn't come to our show last year? And I said, I didn't know about it.
Well,
so
we'll
the response was, well, if I didn't, that means a lot of people here didn't. Would love to be able to get the word out at it as a part of the church's robust communication channel, so that
Thank you.
if we're welcome, we can come. Other questions? Yeah.
May had a question.
Sorry, she was before you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and your wonderful photographs. I had a question for you. I really enjoy doing travel photography and street photography, where things that you want to take, photographs you want to take, of either situations or people in particular, suddenly appear unexpectedly. And I was wondering what your approach is in terms of asking people's permission for taking a photograph of them, and whether you can feel pretty quickly that people are averse or very happy about having their photographs taken. My second question was, I was very fascinated by your work as an editor in the news agency. And I worked in several conflict situations in Africa myself, not as a photographer, but I was working with the UN, so we were trying to actually resolve those situations. So it was very interesting to see that the photographers needed to get their film out to you very quickly. And I was wondering, on average, how long did that really take to get it to you? And how long would it stay newsworthy? You know, how quickly did it need to get to you for actually the papers to want to take it up?
Right. Okay, so the first part. Working on the street, most of the time you don't ask permission, unless I was taking somebody's portrait and they were actually going to stand there and pose for me. But mostly, it's not by permission. The second part of your question about getting film out. So the agency that I worked for, Gamma Liaison, had a main headquarters in Paris. That was part of, they were called Gamma, and the US part was called Liaison. And so photographers in the field, as I said, would have their film taken either by a passenger, a willing passenger. Someone would meet them in Paris usually. The film would be processed overnight, duplicated, sent to 35 different agencies around the world who were part of our network. It would come to New York on the Concorde. Those are the days of the Concorde. We would edit it fast. If it was a conflict situation story, sometimes the photographers would be on assignment for a particular magazine, so that film was earmarked for a particular client. If it wasn't, then they would get almost daily updates. It was very fast working. You had to know what you were doing, and there was no real lag time. And it stayed, you know, news was slower then. There was no internet. And so a weekly magazine was a weekly magazine of news. News didn't change every day. There were no websites to have to dictate the time. And so if something happened on a weekend, yes, there would be a crash to get the story into the magazine that would be closing on Monday night. But if something happened on a Wednesday, you'd have a little bit more time.
So my question is, now that you've taken the negatives out of the closet, are you going to produce a book?
Oh, God, May. Yeah, right after the website. I don't know. I've thought about it. This is a first step. It's gone pretty well so far. I'm feeling good. So we'll see. We'll see. We'll see. I got a very busy day job and sometime night job. So once I get through with those. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? One more question.
Maybe the church could post some of these on their website.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I was thinking the same thing. But, I mean, the artist has to be
talk.
complicit.
Yes, we can talk.
We can negotiate. I mean, I'm afraid to negotiate with her about photo usage, but hopefully we are not for profit, and hopefully we'll make something work.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Is there anything? Everything. And what are you
Well,
looking? We have
one
another
more.
question. Oh, we have two more. My goodness.
God.
You're an interesting lady. I mean, we all knew that, but Star.
I just wondered if you got some sense of personal gratification that you're preserving history, you know, that your preservation is such an important part of street photography, outdoor photography. Did that give you pleasure?
Yes, a lot of pleasure. And looking back on it and combining that with what I do now, I think this is one of those benefits of getting older, of having a fuller picture and being able to look back and appreciate things that you did long ago and see them in perspective and how it relates to what I do now and finding those connections. And that's incredibly satisfying. And also inspiring to, all these new ideas that you've given me tonight of what's going to come next.
Sir, did you have a question? I thought you did.
That's okay. We're neighbors. He can tell me later.
Thank you. Well, I think that you truly are a remarkable and inspiring person.
Thank you.
I think we're all touched by your story. One of the, I guess my the last question of the evening. I'm so struck by this characterization you make of your work as a photographer being a dance. It sounds like the story that you're sharing of your life is also a dance that is similar to how street photography works, which there is this dance, this balance between structure and the construction of a scene or a narrative, at the same time responding to opportunity. It seems like in your own life, being open, not afraid to change your direction and embrace new roles for yourself. Is there something that you see on the horizon that you would like to be a new dance?
Oh. I don't know that it's a new dance. I think it's just the continuation and the maturing of the old dance. I find it hard to work on the street in the city now, so I don't do that, and that's okay. But I find that even though my day-to-day work, my history work, whether it involves me taking photographs or not, there are points of a day where I have to. It's not so much even a have to, it's just an instinct that I'm going to, or that I need to, or and even if it is just walking out on my deck and seeing what the view looks like, or how the trees look, or where the clouds are, or to make that photograph for that moment, is a letting go of the breath. And it is, the practice that I try to do every day. Actually, I don't even have to try, that I do every day. And it is the meditation of my life, and will always be. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. Donnamarie Barnes, please. Thank you. Thank you all for being with us tonight, for sharing this great story and experience. Have a great night. See you again at the church.